Hello everyone, today we'll be reading from Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, an essay written by Friedrich Engels in 1892. This is a very interesting reading because it examines and looks at a part of European history that European historians have explored quite often. It looks at the period between the Reformation and the Great French Revolution. And this, of course, is the period in which Marx and Engels consider that the bourgeoisie, that is the capitalist class, was able to come out on top, was victorious and became the dominating class of European society. It is also the period that we consider, all historians almost consider, to be the beginnings of modern Europe and what we refer to as the modern period of history. So Marx and Engels begin by informing us that the great international center of feudalism was the Roman Catholic Church. They say it united Europe into one grand political system. It opposed the schismatic Greeks and Islam, had its own hierarchy on the feudal model, and most importantly, it owned 1/3 of the soil of the Catholic world, that is, most of Europe. And this is quite significant because, well, firstly, the Catholic Church is quite literally an institution which is the largest landholder in Europe. But secondly, what is being implied is that Catholicism and the Catholic Church as an institution provided the ideological and institutional support for feudalism to exist all across Europe. Science had already rebelled against the church. You may know of Kepler, you may know of Galileo, you may know of Bruno or Copernicus. Engels informs us that the bourgeoisie joined in this rebellion. Now, this led to a massive anti-feudal revolt. And the characteristics of this anti-feudal revolt were that, first of all, the class that was most interested in the struggle against the church was the capitalist class. But every struggle at that time directed against the church had to be undertaken in a religious disguise. It had to be directed against the church, but it had to be directed against the church in the name of religion. It couldn't leave that ground, let's say. So universities and the traders of the city started the cry, but it found a very strong echo in the peasants. And this led to three great decisive battles. The first one was the Protestant Reformation in Germany between 1523 and 1525. Also the revolt by Franz von Sickingen, which is the same, 1523, and the Great Peasants' War of 1525, all of which together constitute the Great Protestant Reformation. The second great revolt is England in 1648, and this, of course, is the Cromwellian Revolution, which in different ways continues till 1688 and culminates in the Glorious Revolution. The third great revolt is the French Revolution of 1789, which was carried out purely in the name of materialism, on the philosophical foundation of materialism. So let's look at each of these revolts in some detail. The first one, that is the Protestant Revolution, was inspired by Martin Luther. As I've already stated, it led to two massive revolts. The first was Franz von Sickingen in 1523, and the second was the Great Peasant Wars in 1525. This was a very violent revolt, but sadly, it did not succeed. It failed to bring to power the middle classes, and the church was pretty much successful, although it did establish Protestantism as a separate and distinct part of Christianity. Why did it fail? Well, firstly, Engels says the first reason was the indecision of the burghers of the town. The burghers of the town just means the traders of the town. These are small traders, and they were very indecisive in this battle. Secondly, he says it degenerated into a fight between the local princes and the central power. And because it was defeated, it blotted out Germany for 200 years from the politically active nations of Europe. It created a religion adapted to absolute monarchy, though, and sadly, northeastern German freemen were reduced to serfs. Now, from the Protestant Revolution, we move to John Calvin. Calvinism was fit for the boldest bourgeoisie of his time, says Engels. Calvin's predestination doctrine was the religious expression of the fact that in the commercial world, success or failure does not depend upon a man's activity or cleverness, but upon circumstances uncontrollable by him. So in Calvinism, God's church was now republicanized, and Calvin founded a republic in Holland, that is in Amsterdam. Amsterdam is the first example that we find of the bourgeoisie coming to power in a small city-state. The second great bourgeois revolt is the Cromwellian revolt of 1648. Oliver Cromwell was one of the signatories of the death warrant of King Charles I in 1649. He was a member of the Rump Parliament from 1649 to 1653, and he dominated the short-lived Commonwealth of England. So the Cromwellian Revolution was ignited by the middle class of the towns, but it was fought out by the yeomanry of the countryside, the peasants of the countryside, who fought it out to a finish. Even though the peasantry is and was just the class that was destroyed by the victory against feudalism, because as you may know, they were later converted into proletarians and their actual living conditions deteriorated when they converted from being serfs to becoming proletarians. So King Charles I was executed in 1649. By 1660, the royalists managed to reorganize, mainly from Scotland and Ireland, etc., and restored the monarchy in 1660, but the House of Commons continued to fight them, leading to the Glorious Revolution in 1688. Now this was basically the overthrow of King James II of England by a union of English parliamentarians. Eventually, a compromise was reached between the capitalist class and the feudal landowners or former feudal landowners, and that compromise of 1688 has continued till today. Now, why did this peculiar compromise between the middle class, that is the capitalist class at that time, and the landed class, the aristocracy, come about? Firstly, because the old feudal barons had been fighting a war of succession called the War of Roses, and they had killed each other they had committed each other to such a brutal war against each other that they had weakened their entire feudal system as a result of this terrible internal war. Their successors, therefore, fully understood the value of money and were far more bourgeois in their habits and tendencies. And then, of course, Henry VIII's confiscation of church lands created a new bourgeois whole scale. And of course, Henry VIII was not averse to marrying into the bourgeoisie. He married Anne Boleyn, etc. So now the English aristocracy was ready to cooperate because of its own weakness with the newly rising bourgeoisie. Hence, the English bourgeoisie and the English landed classes merged together and became one ruling class. The English bourgeoisie now was part of the ruling class. Because it was part of the ruling class, it also took upon itself the task of keeping down the lower orders, the great producing mass of the nation. And the means that they began to use to keep poor people quiet was the influence of religion. The philosophy of materialism has its own history in England, but the interesting thing about materialism in England is that it was considered a philosophy fit for the cultivated men of the world, that is, for the landed classes, in contrast to religion, which was considered for the uneducated masses. So England had both materialism as a philosophy and deism as a philosophy. You may have heard of Thomas Hobbes. He was pro-monarchy, he was pro-absolutist monarchy, he was pro the royalty, and yet his entire understanding of how politics functions was based on a mechanical materialist understanding of the world. Similarly, we have Bolingbroke and we have Shaftesbury, who created a new deistic form of materialism. All of this materialism and deism was considered abhorrent, was totally abhorrent to the middle class. First of all, it was a religious heresy, and secondly, it was in its politics totally against the middle class. It was very much pro the landed class. And here's the really interesting part about history, that the materialist ideas that belonged to the feudal class of England passed from England to France, where they became now the philosophy not of the landed class of France, but of the middle class, that is the bourgeoisie of France. So Engels writes, the doctrine hatched by English royalists gave a theoretical flag to the French Republicans and terrorists and furnished the text for the declaration of the rights of man. How ironic that materialism, which was the philosophy of the landed class in England, became the philosophy of the bourgeoisie of French. The French Revolution was the third great uprising of the bourgeoisie, and it was the first of the uprisings of the bourgeoisie which completely cast off the religious cloak. It was not fought on the foundation of religion, but on political lines alone. It was also the first which was fought to a decisive finish. It led to the destruction of one of the combatants, that is the aristocracy, and to the complete triumph of the capitalist class. Engels writes that in France, the revolution constituted a complete breach with the traditions of the past. It cleared out the very last vestiges of feudalism and created the civil code. Of course, the French Revolution later led to the French Revolutionary Wars, which gave the English a splendid opportunity, with the help of other continental monarchies, to destroy French maritime commerce and annex French colonies, crush the last French pretensions to maritime rivalry, etc. So in other words, the English bourgeoisie opposed the French Revolution. But why? This sounds very strange and a bit ironic even. You would expect that the middle classes of England would support the middle classes in France, but that is not the case. And here's another interesting irony. The French royalists supported the American revolutionaries against their rivals in England. So here we see the complex politics between England, France, and the United States of America playing itself out. The French Revolution went very much against the thinking of the English bourgeoisie, says Engels. Its exacerbable terrorism, materialism, and republican trends were completely abhorrent to the English bourgeois. The British bourgeoisie felt that the aristocracy taught him manners, invented fashions, furnished officers for the army, kept order at home, built the navy, which conquered colonial possessions and new markets abroad. So as materialism became the creed of the French Revolution, the English bourgeoisie became all the more God-fearing and held faster to his religion. But England itself was also undergoing an incredible revolution by this time. James Watt, Arkwright, Cartwright led the Industrial Revolution. By 1830, the English bourgeoisie, the capitalist class of England, was much more wealthy. And they passed the Reform Act of 1830. They passed the repeal of the Corn Laws to gain greater say in the Parliament. And of course, throughout the 19th century was a period of incredible industrial change. Now, this created a new class of people. It created a class of working people that was connected to industry. This is called the industrial proletariat, or just the proletariat. The proletariat gradually increases in numbers and strength in proportion as industry obviously develops. The proletariat forced a reluctant parliament to repeal the acts forbidding combinations of workmen in 1824. In other words, forbidding trade unions. So by 1824, given that parliament had passed the law that workers could come together in trade unions in combinations to bid up their price, you will see soon in the 19th century the emergence of the first great working class movements, including trade unions. During the Reform agitation, the working men constituted the radical wing of the Reform Party. They formulated their demands in the People's Charter and constituted themselves in opposition to the great bourgeois anti-Corn Law Party into an independent party, the Chartists, the first working men's party of modern times. So this is a very interesting paragraph because it points out that working people often form the radical wing of big bourgeois parties, and eventually as that radical wing separates itself from these big, capitalist parties, that's when working class parties emerge in a big way. I can think of the Pakistan People's Party in this regard. If you are in the United States of America, one can think of the Democratic Party, which is supported by the AFL-CIO and by the labor movement in the United States of America. By 1848, massive revolutions had broken out all over Europe. Between February and March, nearly every country in Europe was in the throes of a working class revolt or of a bourgeois middle class revolt. The working class played a very prominent role in all these revolts, but By the summer of 1848, most of them were defeated. The Chartists themselves were defeated by April 10th, 1848. The Paris workingmen's insurrection was crushed in June 1848. And by 1849, there were disasters in Italy, Hungary, South Germany. And of course, then by 1851, Louis Bonaparte had conquered Paris, etc., had obtained victory over Paris, etc., and then set out in his mission across the European continent. So the great revolts of 1848 were not successful, but they caused a very interesting change. Having witnessed the big revolts of 1848, the English bourgeoisie began to support religion even more in order to quell revolts. They began to support the evangelization of the lower orders. They appealed to Brother Jonathan, who was the great organizer at that time of religion as a trade. And they even imported from America revivalism, Moody and Sankey and the like. And finally accepted the dangerous aid of the Salvation Army, which of course revives the ideas of early Christianity and appeals to the poor as the elect of God, but fights capitalism in a religious way and ultimately leads to the reconciliation of the working class and the bourgeoisie rather than to class warfare. If we compare America and Europe, we discover that there is no European country in which the bourgeoisie was able to hold exclusive political power for any length of time. They either had to compromise with the landed class, or where they held power, it was only for a little while. We are of course talking about the 19th century at this time. But in America, a very different kind of society was coming about, because in America, you had a durable reign of the bourgeoisie all this time, because feudalism was simply unknown. There was no feudalism in America. The people who had emigrated to the United States of America were all people who were either working class or middle class. Those who had massive estates didn't want to leave their estates and go to the United States of America. They, of course, remained in Europe. So America as a civilization, as a country, really begins as a purely exclusively bourgeois capitalist society. It's the most capitalist society one can think of, precisely because it never had a feudal class. It never had an aristocracy. The English bourgeoisie, on the other hand, says Engels, are deeply penetrated by a sense of complete inferiority, such that they keep at their own expense and at the expense of the people a caste of drones to represent the nations. I love this expression, caste of drones, because they don't actually do any work. He's of course talking about the English royalty. He's talking about the crown. And the bourgeoisie consider themselves highly honored whenever one of themselves is found worthy of admission into this select and privileged body, manufactured after all by themselves. And you can see this even today, that the English, they just love the royal family. The royal family are, the great stars, the great celebrities of England. Engels writes, the French bourgeoisie did not find this out until they had done their level best to break up religion forever. And now it was the turn of the British bourgeoisie to sneer and say, why, you fools, I could have told you that 200 years ago. Now, Engels regards tradition as a great retarding force, but he says tradition is a passive force. It can't actually build anything. It can only try and stop things. And so he thinks that despite the fact that religion is being used in England in his time to stop the workers from organizing themselves, but he says religion cannot provide a lasting safeguard to capitalist society. He ends this chapter by making a prediction. He says, Germany was the starting point of the great first upheaval of the European middle classes. Who knows if it will be the scene of the great victory of the European proletariat. Hasn't happened yet, but let's see what happens in the future. So finally, I would like to conclude by pointing out to you that in this essay on European history, materialism is applied to understand politics, but it's applied in a very complex and nuanced way to understand history. It isn't the case that all bourgeois people stand on one side and all the proletariats of Europe stand on the other side and they fight it out. Quite the contrary, you saw that the English bourgeoisie supported the French royalists. The French royalists in turn supported the American Revolution of the American bourgeoisie, and so on and so forth. And also you saw that the materialist ideas of the English landed class became the philosophical foundation of the French middle class, the capitalist class, or the bourgeoisie. So history proceeds in very complex ways. It's the same with respect to religion. Religion, you can see in this essay, was used in many, many different ways. First of all, to justify the existence of feudalism, that is the Roman Catholic Church. Secondly, as a revolt against feudalism and against the Roman Catholic Church, that was Protestantism and Calvinism. And then in the third phase, as a means to suppress working class revolts in the shape of the Salvation Army and evangelicalism, etc. We also see that it takes a very long time for a new mode of production, a new economic system to emerge from an old economic system. It takes 200 years before the bourgeoisie is able to finally come to power in one single country, that is in France. It takes the entire period from the Reformation, the German Reformation, all the way to the French Revolution. Now that's a 200-year period history. And in this period, there are many instances in which the bourgeoisie is forced, first of all, to retreat. It is not successful. And in this complex portrayal of history, we don't see a unilinear evolution or development of history. We see a complex development of history. In the first great fight between the middle class and the landed class, it's the middle class that loses and the landed class becomes dominant. That is, of course, the Protestant Reformation. In the second great battle between these two classes, we come to a situation where the two classes come to a compromise. That's the Glorious Revolution, from the Cromwellian Revolution to the Glorious Revolution, from 1648 to 1688. And in the third great contradiction between these two classes, that is the French Revolution, finally the bourgeoisie is able to overpower the landed class and take exclusive political power. But by this time, the bourgeoisie that has emerged in England is actually helping the royalists fight the French bourgeoisie. So what we see here is that history is quite complex, and Marx and Engels were not in favor of examining history through any preconceived idealist sort of constructions of history, but rather they always proceeded from the facts of history to develop their political theory from the evidence of history, rather than to impose a preconceived notion onto the facts of history. Hope you enjoyed that lecture. Thank you very much.